Fatal Policy by Anthony Darter, Chapter 1. The morning sun was already baking the pavement when I turned the corner onto the block, the heat radiating off the brickwork in shimmering waves. It was a bright, clean summer day, the kind that felt out of place for an office that usually dealt in the shadows of other people's lives. When I reached the office door and turned the key, I expected to see Sarge already at her station, coffee brewing and the morning reports filed. But the room was empty. The morning light hit the dust motes dancing in the air, highlighting the stillness. I set Hammett's carrier on the floor, and the cat stepped out with his usual deliberate grace, tail held high. I walked over to the corner to set out his fresh water and food, the silence of the office feeling unusually heavy. My gaze drifted to the coffee percolator sitting cold and abandoned on the counter. "Hammett, how much coffee does Sarge usually put in this damn thing?" I asked, eyeing the metal canister. Hammett didn't even look up from his bowl. He let out a sharp, dismissive meow and sauntered off toward the sunny patch of carpet near the radiator. "You're a lot of help," I muttered. I decided the coffee could wait. I didn't have the patience to ruin a pot before the day had even begun. So I headed into my office, sat down, and pulled the morning paper toward me to see what kind of trouble the rest of the world was in. I was halfway through an editorial on city corruption when the front door groaned on its hinges. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. The cadence of the footsteps, that precise, measured tread, was unmistakable. "You're late," I called out, leaning back in my chair. "I've already saved the world this morning. Twice." Sarge didn't miss a beat as she walked into my line of sight, hanging up her coat with military precision. "You haven't even made the coffee. If I did, it wouldn't be strong enough, and you would throw it out," I joked, tapping the newspaper against the desk. Sarge gave me a thin, knowing smile. "You're learning." Joe stood behind her, shaking his head at the familiar back and forth, his expression neutral. He tossed his hat onto the rack and scanned the desk for messages. "Have we had any calls this morning?" "Yeah, some guy named Mickey called," I said, unable to keep the grin out of my voice. "He wants you to trail his girlfriend, Minnie. He thinks she's fucking around with some guy named Goofy. I told him you were the one for the job. You know more about being goofy than anyone." Joe didn't crack, just leaned against the doorframe, deadpan. "As long as he pays up front." Sarge let out a chuckle. I looked at them both, just Joe and Sarge, the same as they'd been for years. They stood there with the easy, practiced efficiency of two people who knew exactly how to divide a room and cover a flank. It was a good team. They were so locked into their professional roles that it was almost boring, which was exactly how I liked it. "Well," I said, standing up and tucking my chair in, "I think I'm going to run down to the diner and have some breakfast. You two coming along?" No, we've already had breakfast," Joe replied, his focus already drifting back to the morning mail. "I see how it is," I said, grabbing my hat and heading for the door. "Too busy for the boss." I stepped out into the hallway, the cool air of the office quickly replaced by the sweltering heat of the street. As I walked toward the diner, I didn't give them another thought. It was a quiet morning, the team was in place, and for once, the world didn't seem to be catching fire. The diner was a sanctuary of linoleum and hum, the air conditioning doing a valiant job against the humid, pressing weight of the morning. I eased into my favorite booth at the back, sliding in just as the ceiling fan above me cut through the thick air. Rose didn't spot me at first. She was mid-sprint between the counter and a table of construction workers, balancing a tray of steaming plates. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a second, enjoying the quiet before the lunch rush hit. When she finally swung by, she dropped a napkin dispenser in front of me with a practiced thud. "Good morning, dear. What will it be?" "Coffee, for starters," I said. She arched an eyebrow, gesturing toward the sweltering windows. "In this heat?" I shrugged, feeling the first drip of sweat dry on my forehead. "Of course. I could be sitting in hell and still want coffee, but a glass of ice water is in order as well. I think I would like the steak and eggs this morning." "Coming right up. By the way, you just missed Joe and Sarge," Rose said, wiping down the table. I blinked. They got to the office just before I left. Were they acting odd when they were here? I wouldn't say odd, she said, pondering it for a second. They ate their food, talked, and left for the office. She moved off toward the kitchen, leaving me to contemplate the news. Odd? No, Rose was right. They were the most consistent people I knew. If they hadn't acted odd in front of Rose, they hadn't been acting odd at all. I was probably just looking for ghosts in the machine. A moment later, the bell above the diner door jingled. I looked up, expecting a regular, but instead saw Paulie walking in, favoring his left side and sporting a shiner that was already blooming into a majestic shade of eggplant. I couldn't help the smirk that tugged at my mouth. Didn't know when to shut up? Paulie slid into the booth opposite me, wincing as he settled. No, smartass. Veronica had a bad dream and accidentally hit me in the eye. Bad dream? Sure, Paulie. Believe what you want to believe, I said, my grin widening. I think you mouthed off and she clocked you. She would never, Paulie insisted, though he looked a little less sure of himself than he sounded. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, her husband cowered in fear of that woman. I'm convinced he died for his own protection. If I was married to her, I would be looking for a way out as well. I chuckled, tapping the table. You had better hope that Veronica took after her father. Otherwise, it's like looking into a crystal ball. You can see what your future looks like. Very funny, Jack, Paulie grumbled, though he finally cracked a pained smile. The clatter of the kitchen door silenced our banter as Rose emerged with my coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls. I took a sip, the familiar bitter heat grounding me. It was a normal morning, just the guys, the coffee, and the quiet. So, I said, setting the mug down, anything interesting happen on your way over, or are you just here to show off the new hardware? No, I figured you would be here, Paulie grunted, rubbing his jaw gingerly. Besides, it's a diner. What the hell do you think I'm doing here? Collecting for the Salvation Army? I need food. I don't even care what at this point. I'm sure the cook can find a fat rat in the alley, I said, leaning back as I watched Rose head back toward the kitchen. Paulie didn't even blink. I'd eat the damn thing. How about a steak instead, I asked. His face brightened despite the darkening bruise. Even better. I caught Rose's eye as she passed by with a pot of coffee and signaled for another plate. She gave a quick nod, and a few minutes later, she dropped a fresh steak and eggs in front of Paulie. He tore into it like he hadn't seen a meal in a week. No sooner had the plates been cleared of the first few bites than the bell above the door chimed again. In walked Dogface and Handsome. They navigated the diner with that distinct, hard-boiled swagger, pulling up chairs at our booth until it was packed tight. What's this new case Joe was talking about? Dogface asked, eyes narrowed. He said you had famous clients. Said to ask you about it. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, racking my brain. Joe? Then it hit me. I let out a bark of laughter that nearly made me choke on my coffee. Oh, that, I said, wiping my mouth. I told Joe he was on a high-stakes tail job. Mickey Mouse is convinced his girl Minnie is stepping out on him with Goofy. Dogface and Paulie erupted, Paulie nearly spitting out a mouthful of steak. Handsome, however, just sour, shaking his head with a look of genuine disappointment. That's a shame, he said, his voice completely deadpan. They always seemed so happy together. The sincerity in his tone was so perfect. It hit the table like a physical blow. The whole booth exploded. The laughter was so loud it pulled in the room. Rose let out a hoot from behind the counter, and Big Mike, sitting at a corner table with his regulars, turned around to see what the commotion was. What's the joke? Big Mike bellowed. When we finished gasping out the story, he gave a slow, thoughtful nod. If you ever get Betty Boop as a client, send her my way. Rose didn't miss a beat as she swung by with the coffee pot. Mike, I don't think you could handle Betty. His whole table roared, and for a few minutes, the diner didn't feel like a place where People came to hide from their problems. It felt like an island. When the plates were finally cleared, and we'd put away enough coffee to keep a race car running through the night, we filed out of the diner. The heat was still there, waiting for us on the sidewalk, but it felt a little less suffocating now. We walked back toward the office, the guys still chuckling over Handsome's deadpan delivery, the kind of camaraderie that made the job worth doing. We reached the office, the familiar lettering on the glass door greeting us. I opened the door and stepped inside, the cool, quiet air of the agency waiting to pull us back into the grind. Well, I said, dropping my keys on the desk. Back to the grind. Let's see if we have any real clients today or if we're stuck with the cartoon division. Chapter 2, the office was a different world from the diner. It was quiet, save for the low hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional thwack of Hammett's paw swatting at a dangling piece of string I was holding. He was in a rare, high-energy mood, batting at the string with a focused intensity that made me chuckle. Joe stepped out of his office, saw me playing with the cat, and just shook his head with a smile. The moment lasted until the front door clicked open. Sarge was at her desk, and I heard her cool, professional greeting. "Good morning. May I help you?" I dropped the string and stepped out of my office, Joe trailing behind. The woman standing in the center of our workspace looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a gala. She was wrapped in a mink coat that looked like it cost more than the building, and she held her head at an angle that suggested she was smelling something unpleasant. "I am Doris Pentlow," she announced, her voice as crisp as fresh linen. "How can we help you, Mrs. Pentlow?" I asked, moving to the front of the room. She didn't waste time. "I am here because I feel my husband is being unfaithful. Every time I call his office, his secretary says he is in a meeting. He does not return home until after midnight. This just started about 3 months ago." Joe leaned against the door frame, his notebook already out. "What does your husband do?" "Oh, how silly of me," she said, fluttering a gloved hand. "Marcus is an advertising executive at Pentlow and Gates Advertising. Have you heard of them?" "We are aware of them." I did. Sarge began jotting down the information, her pen moving with rhythmic, efficient strokes. "You mentioned a secretary," I continued. "What can you tell us about her?" "I don't know much about her. I believe her name is Drax. Yes, Vivian Drax. Marcus hired her about a year ago. Young girl. He does not speak of her much." "Is that who you suspect he is fucking around with?" I asked. "Pardon my language. Being unfaithful with?" Doris paused. "I can't be sure. That's why I came to you. He knows my car. I can't be snooping around. We have a good standing in this community. I couldn't soil our reputations." "If he is running around, don't you think that will ruin your reputations?" Joe asked. "That's what I would like to avoid." "You want us to get our hands dirty so you can keep your hands clean?" I asked. Doris took a slow, sweeping look around the room. Her eyes landed on Polly, who was napping on the couch in the corner, and then drifted to my cluttered, paper-strewn desk, and finally rested on Hammett, who had trotted over to sniff her expensive heels. She recoiled slightly, a look of genuine disgust on her face. "Precisely," she said. "From the look of things, you enjoy dirt." If looks could kill, Sarge's piercing blue eyes would have set this woman on fire. I noticed the tension, but I didn't dwell on it. Doris was just another client with a chip on her shoulder. "Come over to our secretary, Miss James," I said, gesturing to the desk. "She can set up an account and take the retainer fee." "How much will you charge?" Doris asked. $500 up front, $100 a day, plus expenses." "That's outrageous," Doris said. "I won't pay it." "That's the price of keeping your hands clean, Mrs. Pentlow," I said in a low register, letting her know there was no wiggle room. Doris set up the account with Sarge and walked out, the mink coat swishing behind her. "I would have charged her more," Sarge muttered. "Oh yeah?" I asked. "I already can't stand that snobby bitch," Sarge said. "Put the claws away, Sarge," Joe said. I just smiled. "Look up this ad agency. See what you can find out." It isn't Minnie Mouse, but it's something, Joe said. Sarge found the address of the ad agency and handed it to Joe. All right, Joe, grab your coat. Sarge, find out what you can about the husband. Hammett, keep guard. Polly, keep that couch warm. I'm way ahead of you, Morgan, Polly said from the couch, not even bothering to open his eyes. Joe remained quiet for most of the drive, his gaze fixed on the city passing by the window. The heat made the air inside the car feel thick and stagnant. I finally tried to stir the pot, just to shake off the lingering irritation from our client. Did you see that look Sarge gave that woman? I thought she was going to strangle her before the check was signed. Joe didn't turn his head, but his mouth quirked into a faint smile. Yeah, Sarge is one hell of a woman. I don't know how she puts up with us. Sucker for punishment, I guess? I joked, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel. I don't know if I would say that, Joe countered. I think the military background has a lot to do with it. Plus, things are never boring when we are around. She could be a secretary anywhere, but she sticks with us. Maybe she's just waiting for a better offer, I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. We pulled the car up to the curb across the street from the ad agency. It was a clean, imposing building, the kind of place where people pretended they weren't selling lies for a living. Joe scanned the entrance. We don't even know what this Marcus looks like. Just look for a middle-aged man in a fancy suit with a young girl hanging on his arm with dollar signs in her eyes, I replied, lighting a cigarette and letting the smoke drift out the open window. Joe let out a dry chuckle. This is Hollywood, Jack. You can see that on every street corner and drugstore counter. The lady didn't give a description. That's the best I have at the moment, I said. I watched a group of men in sharp suits exit the building, checking them against the mental image I had of a man like Pentlow. Do you think Mrs. Pentlow is really all that concerned about what inkwell the husband is dipping his quill in? Or do you think she's afraid of the allowance running out? Joe tapped his fingers on the dashboard. The husband messing around seemed to be less of a concern than preserving her reputation. I've never understood that mindset. It has to be a miserable life, worrying about what everyone else might think. Social standing is all most of these people have, I said, watching the building entrance. They've already lost their souls in the pursuit of a buck. I didn't see a tear in her eyes. She didn't even try to fake an emotion. That's the kind of client who pays the bills, though, Joe said. At least she doesn't pretend to be something she isn't. She's cold, but she's transparent. I nodded, blowing a stream of smoke out the window. Yeah, let's just hope the husband is as predictable as she is. The sun had been relentless, turning the DeSoto into a rolling oven until we finally gave up on the stakeout and headed back. The office felt like a walk-in freezer by comparison, and Sarge looked like she hadn't broken a sweat all day. She had the desk covered in files, photos, press clippings, and even a heavy film canister. This is quite impressive, Sarge, I said, flipping through a file on Jerry Gates. I need to talk to your sources. There might be things about me that I don't even remember. A lady must keep her secrets, Jack, she replied, her tone light and playful. We rigged the projector, aiming it at the blank wall above the couch. As I killed the lights, the machine began its rhythmic, mechanical clatter, and a harsh white beam cut through the dim room. Paulie, who had been dead to the world, jerked upright, throwing his hands up to block the glare. Jesus Christ almighty! You should have warned me this was a horror film, I cracked. Paulie squinted, his black eye looking particularly nasty in the flicking light. Very funny, Morgan. It's getting to where a man can't take a nap without being blinded. Oh, shut up and watch the movie, Joe said, not looking away from the screen. Here, pull up a chair. Did anybody bring popcorn? Paulie grumbled, though he settled in. The film was a self-congratulatory slog through the agency's history. Starting way back in 1923, it droned on about their first big campaigns, a lot of industry backpatting. That didn't mean a damn thing to us. We sat through the boring preamble, waiting for the money shot. Then, Marcus Pentlow appeared. He was a silver-haired, middle-aged man in a sharp-pressed three-piece suit, the kind of guy who looked like he checked his reflection in every window he passed. But it was the next shot that held our attention. Vivian Drax. She was thin, blonde, and young, definitely mid-20s. She had that sharp, predatory elegance that stood out even in a grainy educational film. She wasn't just standing in the background. She was practically vibrating with the need to be seen. Every time the camera panned her way, she tilted her chin just right, playing to the lens like she was auditioning for a part in a noir thriller. She had that Gloria Graham pout, the kind that looked like it could get a man into a lot of trouble. As the film wrapped up, the projector hummed to a stop, leaving us in the quiet gloom of the office. "She's a real piece of work, isn't she?" Joe said, breaking the silence. I nodded, thinking back to the ice-cold, snooty demeanor of Doris Pentlow. She's a piece of work, and he's a vanity project. Now we just have to find out if she's the one currently holding the leash. "Well," Polly said, finally wide awake, "we know what they look like. Should I start the car, or are we going to wait for them to invite us to dinner?" Chapter 3. Polly? "We're going to drop you off at your house," I said, putting the DeSoto in gear. "Jump in the Plymouth and meet us at the ad agency. We follow the husband when he leaves. You take the girl. If the wife is right, he's been out late for months. Let's see where he's actually burning the midnight oil." "I'm on it, Jack," Polly said, his voice sharpening with the prospect of actual work. Even with his shiner, he looked ready for a fight. After dropping him, Joe and I circled the block until we found a good vantage point across from the agency. We tucked the DeSoto into a deep shadow behind a parked delivery truck. The heat was still oppressive, sticking our shirts to our backs as we waited. We didn't have to wait long. Polly's Plymouth rolled in a few minutes later, its engine barely a whisper, as he tucked it neatly into the shadows down the street, facing the opposite direction. He gave us a short, sharp nod as he passed. We waited until the city lights hummed to life, turning the sky a bruised purple. Around 9, the agency doors finally swung open. Vivian Drax stepped out first. She walked with a deliberate, rhythmic sway that had nothing to do with the wind, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She climbed into a flashy convertible that looked like it cost 3 times a secretary's annual salary. Polly hung back, waiting for her to clear the curb before he eased the Plymouth into the flow of traffic like a ghost. A moment later, Marcus Pentlow emerged. He looked less like a high-powered executive and more like a man holding his breath, constantly scanning the street. He climbed into his Cadillac, and I put the DeSoto in gear, keeping the headlights off until we were a half block behind him. It was a short, predictable parade through the city. They didn't lead us on a wild goose chase. They led us straight to the shady palms. It was a dump, the kind of place where the neon sign hummed a low, dying buzz, and the sheets were probably older than the guests. The motel was a sprawl of peeling stucco and gravel, isolated from the better part of town. Marcus walked into the office, his posture stiff, his eyes darting around the lot. A minute later, he walked out with a key in his hand. He and Vivian didn't even bother with the pretense of distance. They walked straight to a unit halfway down the line. I pulled the DeSoto into a darkened spot 2 rows over, killing the lights and the engine. The silence of the lot was heavy, broken only by the clicking of cooling metal. "That's the room," I muttered, pointing to the glowing window. The one right next to where Dan Johnson was found with his throat slashed. "I hope they changed the sheets, at least," I joked, though the humor felt cold in the night air. Joe stared at the closed door, his expression grim, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. "With as much blood as there was on that bed, I would imagine they had to redecorate the whole fucking room." I couldn't just sit there. I climbed out, moving low along the dark stucco walls, my shadow stretching long against the gravel. I reached the side window, pressing my back against the wall. I didn't need to see inside to know what was happening. The symphony of rhythmic, squeaking bed springs and muffled, urgent voices was all the evidence anyone with ears would ever need. It was messy, it was loud, and it was entirely lacking in the class Mrs. Pentlow's mink coat suggested. I made my way back to the car, my boots crunching softly on the gravel, my pulse steadying as I reached the door. "Well," I said, sliding into the driver's seat. I guess that confirms Doris's suspicions. The husband is definitely sticking it to the secretary. Does that close the case? Joe asked, watching the unit's window. No, we need concrete evidence for the wife, I said. Doris needs proof she can hang over his head. Rose has a camera she'll let us use, and I know a guy who'll develop the film discreetly. We follow them again tomorrow. If they want to play house, we're going to make sure they have a permanent record of the performance. Joe looked at the room, then back at me. Tomorrow it is. We sat in the dark for a long time, watching the lights in the room flicker out until the only light left was the dying neon sign. The office was still simmering with the day's heat when we got back, but Sarge was there, her desk organized as if the world hadn't just been spinning off its axis. All right, men, I said, dropping my keys on the counter. Tomorrow morning we meet at the diner for breakfast. It's going to be a long day. Polly, you ride with us. Leave the Plymouth at home. We know wherever he goes, Drax will go too, so we need to stay mobile and keep the fleet tight. Sounds good, Polly replied, settling into his favorite chair. But you're buying breakfast. Veronica has me on an allowance. Joe leaned against the filing cabinet, a sly grin spreading across his face. Are you sure she will let you come out to play with us? If I tell her Jack is buying, she will, Polly retorted without missing a beat. I couldn't help but laugh. Fine, I'll pay. I'm sure there will be some crumbs in the grease trap for you. Hey, it's a meal I don't have to pay for, Polly said, shrugging his shoulders. Who am I to bitch? You would find something, I said, grabbing my hat. From the day we met you in Basic, you have always been able to find something to bitch about. It is your superpower. Polly didn't hesitate. Yeah, and you've always been an asshole. I felt that familiar grin tugging at my mouth. It took many years to perfect, but I'm really good at it now. I can attest to that, Sarge added. She didn't even look up from her paperwork, her pen continuing to scratch across the ledger with lethal efficiency. I let out a genuine chuckle. Chit Sarge. I'm going home. To hell with all of you, I said with a grin. I scooped Hammett up off the corner of the desk. He gave a soft, indignant protest, but settled into the crook of my arm as I headed for the door. I stepped out into the night, the cooling air feeling like a relief after a long, humid day. I didn't look back at the office. I just wanted a drink and a few hours of sleep before the sun came back up to bake the pavement all over again. The morning air was already thick with the smell of exhaust and impending heat when we pulled up to the diner. With the Kodak camera stowed safely on the seat between Joe and me, we stepped inside. The place was humming, but Rose kept her eyes on the door. She caught us before we even sat down, coffee pot in hand. Drink up, boys. Sounds like you're going to need it today. We slid into our usual booth, Polly tagging along with a look of hungry anticipation. When the plates arrived, my ham was thick-cut and salty. The eggs perfectly runny, Joe ordered the corned beef hash. But Polly's plate was a joke, literally. A few lonely crumbs sat in the center of the china. Don't get too full now, Polly, Rose said, not missing a beat. Polly looked at the plate, then at me. You just had to get your wife in on it, didn't you, Morgan? It was all her idea, I said, holding up my hands. I highly doubt that, Polly grumbled. He looked up at Rose, trying to keep his dignity. Rose, how about the real plate now? Rose held her expression steady, though the corner of her mouth twitched. That is a real plate, Polly. Polly looked like he'd been kicked. Okay, Rose sighed, finally cracking a smile. I don't have all day to torture you, that's what these two are for. She swapped the empty plate for a full order of ham and eggs, and Polly dove in like he hadn't eaten in a week. Slow down there, Polly, Joe joked. Are you afraid she might change her mind? I'm not going to give her the chance, Polly mumbled through a mouthful of toast. Stop when you get to the plate, I warned. I didn't agree to pay for a new one. Polly was the first one done, stopping just short of licking the porcelain clean before lighting up a smoke. What do you think we're going to see today, fellas? Probably not much, I said, checking the camera settings. We're just trying to get some shots of Pentlow and the secretary, get some dirt for the wife to hang over his head. But, you know us, things have a tendency to get complicated. Just then, Dog Face and Handsome drifted in, sliding into the booth beside us. Good morning, detectives, Dogface said. What do you have going on today? I gave them the rundown. Doris, Marcus, and the little secretary, Vivian Drax. Handsome's brow furrowed. Pentlow? Marcus Pentlow? Yeah, big shot ad executive. Name sounds familiar, Handsome said. A guy I know, someone who takes care of problems, mentioned that name. Said some dame was asking about his services. Joe leaned forward, his voice low. Did he give a description of this woman? No, just that she was looking to have a job done. Joe looked at me, his eyes narrowing. Jack, do you think the wife is trying to have them bumped off? I don't see it, but it's possible, I said. It's one way to keep her hands clean. Handsome, see what you can dig up. The last thing we need is to walk into a fucking crossfire. I'll see what I can find, Jack, Handsome promised. Dogface leaned in, his voice dropping. If it's who I think it is, you probably know him, Morgan. Good guy, but lethal. See? Paulie muttered, extinguishing his cigarette. Things are already complicating. We polished off the rest of the meal and headed the door. The heat hit us like a physical blow. Be careful out there, dear, Rose called out. I'll try, I replied. If you come home with more holes than you already have, she smirked, I'll finish the job for them. Love you too, dear, I said, ushering the guys out to the DeSoto. We made a quick stop for a fresh roll of film, the camera sitting heavy in my lap as we turned the car toward the ad agency. The morning was barely started, and already it was starting to feel like a long, long day. Chapter 4. The morning passed in a monotonous rhythm of city life. People coming, people going, the usual hum of business. It wasn't until the lunch hour that the monotony broke. Marcus Pentlow stepped out of the ad agency with Vivian Drax on his arm, and they climbed into his Cadillac. Looks like they're going somewhere together, I said, putting the DeSoto in gear. Let's see where they go. We followed the Cadillac through the thick city traffic, keeping a comfortable distance, until it pulled up in front of the Mutual Insurance Company. I grabbed the camera from the seat and snagged a few quick shots of them, walking inside arm in arm, looking like a couple without a care in the world. 30 minutes later, they emerged, returned to the car, and drove back to the agency. That seems like an odd place to go for lunch, Paulie remarked. Very odd, Joe agreed. I know the girl that works at the front desk. She went to school with Veronica, Paulie said. We can go see what they were there for. That's actually a good idea, I said. That's why we keep you around, pal. I always figured it was because of my winning personality, Paulie joked. I doubt they are going anywhere until closing time, Joe said, checking his watch. Let's go. We drove back to the insurance company and walked inside. Martha, the small girl behind the desk, lit up when she saw us. Hi, Paulie. How's Veronica? Oh, you know Veronica. As disagreeable as ever, Martha, Paulie answered with a smirk. Martha laughed. How may I help you gentlemen today? I stepped to the desk and flashed my badge. I'm Detective Jack Morgan. This is Detective Joe Russo. You already know this, dummy, I said, pointing a thumb at Paulie. You had a man and a woman come in here earlier, a man named Marcus Pentlow. We are curious what they were here for. Mr. Pentlow is an old client of ours, Martha said. I don't know who the girl was. I've never seen her before. He came in asking about a life insurance policy. For himself? Joe asked. No, for Mrs. Pentlow. I know I'm not supposed to be giving out personal information, but I can go pull his file and see what policy he took out, Martha offered. That would be very helpful, miss, I said. Martha walked over to the large file cabinet and returned with a file. She scanned the documents and said, yes, he took out $1 million life insurance policy on his wife, Doris Pentlow. What does this policy cover? Does it cover murder? I asked. Oh, it covers accidental death, Martha clarified. Thank you, miss. You have been most helpful, Joe said. Are you looking for insurance for yourselves? You look like you could use it, Martha asked with a curious tilt of her head. Not today, but when we do, you will be the one we come to, I said with a grin. We left and got back in the DeSoto. What do you make of it? Joe asked once the doors were shut. I don't know what to make of it, I answered, feeling the weight of the situation. I believe we need to talk to Handsome to see if he found this hit man so we can ask him some questions. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the implications settle in the humid air. It's not just motivation, Joe, it's a timeline. A guy like Pentlow doesn't take out a policy that big unless he's already decided the accident is going to happen. And if he's already talking to guys like the one Handsome mentioned, he isn't planning on waiting for a car crash to do the job for him. We need to find that hitman before he finds Doris, Paulie said, his usual sarcasm replaced by a sharp focus. If we catch him, we catch them. Exactly, I said, putting the car in gear. If we can squeeze the hitter, we get the contract. And if we get the contract, we've got Pentlow and that secretary right where we want them. I pulled into the afternoon traffic. The case had shifted. It wasn't just about catching a cheating husband anymore. It was about stopping a murder before it could happen. We headed toward the district where the shadows were deeper, hoping Handsome had the lead we needed to save a woman who didn't even know she was a target. Handsome wasn't hard to find. When we pulled up to the office, he and Dogface were already there, leaning against the front desk and shooting the breeze with Sarge. She looked like she was tolerating them, but just barely. "I found the guy," Handsome said, skipping the pleasantries as soon as we walked in. "Where can we find him?" "We have a few questions for him," I asked, my fatigue momentarily replaced by the sharp edge of the hunt. Dogface shifted, looking over at Handsome. "He's having lunch with Don Pandolini. The Don requests that you join them." I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Okay, looks like we're having lunch with Don Pandolini and a hitman. Sounds like a great time." We didn't have time to argue. We jumped back into the DeSoto, trailing Dogface and Handsome as they led us toward the city's outskirts and the sprawling Pandolini estate. The mansion was a different world, all manicured lawns and white stone, brightly lit by the harsh, midday sun streaming through the arched windows. We were led into the dining hall. At the head of a massive, polished oak table sat the Don. The man he was talking to sat with his back to us, his posture relaxed. Too relaxed for someone who made a living putting people in the ground. When we walked around to the other side of the table, the man stood up and turned. I froze. "Gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Hill," Pandolini said, his voice smooth as silk. Hill looked up and a look of genuine, surprised recognition crossed his face. "Is this a reunion?" "Hi, Johnny," I said, my voice tight. Pandolini looked between us, his eyebrows arching. "You know each other?" "Yes, we served together, Don Pandolini," Hill replied, his eyes scanning our faces. "Morgan, Russo, and Jackson. The only one of the crew missing is Thorne." "David is a detective in Kansas City," Joe said, his hand staying well away from his holster, though his posture was tense. Paulie didn't have the same restraint. "What the hell are you doing here, Johnny?" "I'm doing some work for the Don," Hill said, leaning back against the table. "Which is why we're here," I said, cutting through the pleasantries. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. We weren't just here to talk to a stranger. We were here to talk to a man who had been in the trenches with us, a man who knew how we worked, and who was now sitting at the right hand of the most dangerous man in the city. "We need to know who hired you for the hit on Doris Pentlow," I said, ignoring the tension in the room and focusing on the target. Hill didn't even flinch. He leaned back, picking up a silver fork and turning it over in his hand. "Her husband, Marcus, came to me. He had this little blonde broad with him. You could tell she was pulling the strings. He said he would pay $10,000 to bump off his wife so he could live a fairy tale life with the blonde dish." Paulie scoffed, the sound sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the mansion. "10,000? Is that all? That asshole just went and took out $1 million policy on his old lady this morning." Hill shrugged, a cold, empty look in his eyes. 10,000 is not chump change, Paulie. Things have been kind of slow lately. Joe stepped forward, his expression hardening. "What brought you to this line of business, Johnny? This isn't how we were taught to use our skills." Hill looked past us, out toward the manicured gardens, as if he were seeing the mud and the shell fire of the war instead of the sunshine. Well, after the war, I worked a few jobs here and there, but nothing ever worked out long, so I figured I'd put our training to use. They trained us to be killers. They never told us how to live a normal life. And from what I've heard, you all haven't given up the life either. The words hit harder than a punch. He was right. We had all traded the uniform for a badge and a gun, and we were still living in the shadows of the things we had to do to survive back then. The difference, Johnny, I said, my voice low and steady, is that we're using those skills to keep people alive, not to pad a scumbag's bank account. Don Pandolini remained silent, watching the exchange with the detached curiosity of a man who owned the board we were playing on. The air in the room was suffocating, heavy with the weight of old war stories and the cold, hard reality of the job in front of us. So, what's it going to be? I asked, looking Hill straight in the eye. You going to finish this contract or are you going to walk away? I'm going to finish the contract. Unless you have a better offer, Hill said, leaning forward. I don't mind helping old army buddies, but a man has to eat. Without even thinking, I cut him off. I'll double it to fuck up Pentlow's entire plan. Hill's eyes narrowed. Double? That does interest me. But what do you care if his old lady dies and he runs off with his secretary? I gave him a thin, sharp grin. Let's just say it's for sport. I don't like Doris Pentlow, but I also don't like Marcus and his gold-digging little bitch secretary. It could be interesting to see how this all plays out. Before Hill could respond, Pandolini leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. Gentlemen, let's eat. We can talk business after lunch. The tension didn't evaporate, but it was sidelined for the service of the meal. The steaks were thick and perfectly seared, the potatoes salted and buttered to perfection. We ate with the quiet, focused efficiency of men who had spent too many years eating out of mess kits. When the plates were cleared, the brandy and cigars arrived, the blue smoke swirling in the shaft of sunlight hitting the table. Hill leaned in, the brandy glass cradled in his hand. You have a deal, Morgan. What do you need me to do? Up your price, I said, smoke curling from my cigar. Tell Marcus that you know he took out a large policy. Tell him that since it has to look like an accident, you have to be meticulous. That takes time, and time is expensive. It requires more money. Such as? Hill asked, his voice low. Half of the policy, I said. $500,000. See how he and the secretary take it. Either they'll choke and cancel the hit, or they'll pay you. Ask for half up front, and the rest when the job is done. Joe shifted, his brow furrowing. What if they go for it? What if they actually pay him the half? Then he does the job, I replied, watching Hill's face. We can't match that kind of scratch, and I'm not going to ask him to go broke on our account. Hill looked at me for a long beat, measuring the request. He stood up, towering over the table, and extended a calloused hand. You have a deal, Jack. I gripped his hand, the shake firm and final. The table was set, the trap was laid, and now all we had to do was wait to see if Pentlow was as greedy or as desperate as we thought he was. Chapter 5. Have the meeting at our office, sir, for all I care, I said, clapping a hand on Hill's shoulder. If they try anything funny, we'll have your back. Hill leaned against the desk, his eyes cold and calculating. I don't think the old man has the guts to try something funny. The girl, on the other hand, I'm not so sure. When you're blinded by gold, you can do just about anything. Paulie stepped in, his expression softening as he looked at our old comrade. When this is all over, we need to go out for a drink. It's been a long time since we've had a drink together, Johnny. We left the Pandolini estate and drove back to the office. When we walked in, Sarge was behind the desk, scanning a stack of reports. Sarge, meet Johnny Hill, I said. He was with us in the snow. Sarge looked him over, her professional mask dropping just long enough for a nod of genuine respect. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hill. Hill grinned, a flash of his old self breaking through the hitman's veneer. Sarge, gotta be a whack. You mean to tell me an officer is working for these two? Jack lost his stripes almost as soon as he got them. We were never known as the most disciplined unit. Sarge chuckled, barely looking up from her papers. I believe it. You could have a 4-star general walk in here, and they still wouldn't listen to orders. Hey, the doorknobs are brass, Joe cut in with a shrug. That's all the brass we need. I led Johnny into my office and handed him the phone. Have them meet you here. Tell them you need to work out some details about the job. Make it seem like the contract is still in play. I walked out, closing the door and leaving him to his work. Do you think this will actually work? Paulie asked, his voice low. I don't know, I admitted, but it's the best way to keep Doris alive. Speak of the devil. The office door swung open and in walked Doris Pentlow, the picture of upper crust snobbery, even in a state of agitation. I see you boys are just standing around, she snapped. Is this what I'm paying you for? Listen, lady, you need to get the hell out of here, I said, my patience wearing thin. I don't have time to explain, but this is bigger than your husband sleeping with his secretary. Go home. We'll call you when it's safe. Safe? What do you mean safe? She shrieked, her composure shattering. I demand you answer me. Keep your fucking voice down, you dumb broad, Paulie hissed, stepping into her space to hush her. Joe took a firm step forward. Mrs. Pentlow, this morning your husband took out $1 million life insurance policy on you. Right now we're trying to prevent him from cashing in. She froze. You mean he? Yes, I confirmed, stepping between her and the door. He hired a man to make it look like an accident. That man is in my office right now, baiting your husband to come here. If things go according to plan, we're going to ensure that contract gets buried. But you cannot be here. Not now. Go home. She stood there for a long moment, visibly reeling from the revelation, before the reality finally took hold. She turned and stumbled out the door. Just as the door clicked shut, Hill walked out of my office. He didn't look back at the phone. The meeting is on, he said. Hill's expression was as unreadable as ever, the kind of stone-faced mask that had kept him alive in the Ardennes and kept him working in the shadows ever since. He didn't look like a man who'd just set a trap for two people who were about to walk through our front door to sign their own death warrants. They'll be here in 20 minutes, he repeated, his voice flat. I told them I needed to go over the final logistics for the accident. Told them the target's habits were proving a bit more difficult to manage than I first thought. That was enough to get the blonde's attention. She wants it done fast. Good, I said, glancing toward the office window. The street below was quiet, the usual hum of the city beginning to fade into the late afternoon lull. Paulie, take the desk outside the inner office. Joe, you cover the hallway. Johnny, you're in my seat. When they walk in, I want them to see you, but I want us to see them. And if she starts reaching for things, Hill asked, pulling a cigarette from his pack. Like I said, she's the one with the fire in her eyes. If she reaches for anything, I said, my voice dropping an octave, you let us handle it. We're not here to let you take the fall for a couple of amateur hour vultures. Paulie pulled his .38 from his shoulder holster, checking the cylinder with a practiced flick of his wrist. He looked over at the door, then back at me. Doris almost tipped the whole damn hand. You think she's actually going to stay home? Or is she going to head straight to Pentlow? She was in shock, Joe said, leaning against the doorframe. She'll head home. She's got enough sense to know she's in over her head now. I hope so, I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. Doris Pentlow didn't strike me as the type to sit in a parlor and drink tea while her life was being auctioned off. I looked at Hill. They're going to walk in here thinking they're buying a death. Make sure you don't give them a reason to think anything else until the trap is fully sprung. We need them to commit to that $500,000. Hill nodded, lighting his cigarette. The smoke rose, catching the late sun filtering through the blinds, painting the room in sharp, dramatic slivers of light and shadow. 20 minutes, Hill said, leaning back in my chair, looking right at home in the middle of our business. Then we see if your boy Marcus has the stomach for what he's bought. I walked over to the supply cabinet and pulled out a fresh box of shells. The air in the office was heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that only comes right before a storm breaks. We were playing a dangerous game, using a killer to catch a killer, and in 20 minutes, we'd know if we'd saved a life or if we'd just set the stage for the bloodiest night of the year. Sarge, I called out toward the outer office. She looked up from her paperwork, her expression calm, her eyes sharp. She already knew. She'd been watching the door, her hand resting near the drawer where she kept the ledger and the extra rounds. Coffee's on, boys, she said, not missing a beat. Try not to bleed on the carpet. I just had it cleaned. I looked at Joe and Polly. We were ready. The trap was set, and the bait was waiting behind the door. The 20 minutes dragged on, each tick of the office clock sounding like a hammer hitting an anvil. We were all keyed up, pacing the small space until the air felt thick enough to chew. Joe finally broke his restless streak and moved over to talk to Sarge, leaning against her desk with a forced casualness that didn't fool anyone. Johnny Hill stayed in my office, his eyes fixed on the frosted glass of the door. He watched Joe and Polly for a long, silent moment before he turned his gaze to me. I don't think Pentlow is the only one with a thing for the secretary, Hill said, his voice barely a murmur. I frowned, keeping my voice low. What are you talking about, Johnny? We're a team. We've just got a good relationship here. Hill let out a short, dry huff of laughter. You don't see it because you're too close, Jack. Step back. Look at the body language, the way he leans over to her when they speak. Like they're the only two people in the room. Look at how she sits when she talks to him. That's not the straight-backed professional secretary that was at the desk when we walked in. I glanced over at Joe, then back at Polly. I'd been so focused on the case, so tunnel-visioned on the hit, that I hadn't looked at the dynamics right in front of my own nose. Hill had spent his life reading people to stay alive. He saw things I'd been blind to. Maybe you're right, I admitted, a strange, uneasy feeling settling in my gut. If that's what's going on, I hope it doesn't become an issue. I'm not sure how to deal with that. Before I could dwell on it, the clock hit the mark. The silence in the room sharpened, turning from anticipation to dread. Everyone, to your places, I commanded, my voice snapping back into the cadence of an officer. Joe straightened up, his hand drifting toward his jacket. Polly took his spot by the partition, his face losing its jokey veneer and hardening into a mask of pure focus. I took a deep breath, checked the chamber of my .45, and signaled for the door. The game was on, and if we were lucky, it would be over in 10 minutes. The air in the office was so thin, it felt like we were all holding our breath. Hill sat behind my desk with his boots propped up, looking like he owned the place, while Marcus and Vivian stood before him like two nervous schoolchildren caught in the principal's office. I stayed by the door, arms crossed, letting the silence work for us. Mr. Morgan is an old friend of mine, and in a similar line of work, Hill said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register used when he was hunting. I brought him in because it is going to take more than one man working alone. That is why I called you here. Marcus fidgeted with his silk tie, his face pale. I'm not sure what you meant over the phone about Doris being unpredictable. She doesn't do anything. She goes to the same shops. It should be easy. Yeah, Vivian piped in, her voice cold and sharp as a razor. Snatch her up and bump her off. Hill stood up then, slow and deliberate. He leaned over the desk, his shadow looming large against the wall. The unpredictable part was you. I was told on good authority that you went to an insurance agency and took out $1 million policy on your wife, and it has to look like an accident. That $10,000 was good for a simple kill. You complicated things. Marcus's jaw dropped. How do you know about that policy? Hill let out a short, humorless laugh. I have eyes all over this city, Pentlow. I know when you go take a shit, and how much paper you use to wipe your ass. Don't forget what I do for a living. I'm not like you with your cushy office. I am a hunter. The effect was immediate. Pentlow and the secretary went wide-eyed, the reality of who they were dealing with finally sinking in. They weren't hiring a criminal. They were hiring a predator. I understand, Marcus whispered, glancing nervously at me by the door. What are you asking? 500,000, Hill said, not blinking. Half of the policy. 250 now, the other half once the job is done. I don't fucking think so, Vivian snapped, her composure cracking. Hill's hand moved to the heavy revolver at his hip, just a twitch of the wrist, but the message was clear. You might want to shut her up before I shut her mouth for good. Marcus grabbed Vivian's arm, his voice trembling. Vivian, let me handle this, love. I do not have that kind of cash on me. I will not have it until the job is done. Hill leaned back, his eyes narrowing into slits. Do you want the job done or not? We can forget all about it and walk away right now. Money has not exchanged hands yet. Vivian didn't hesitate. She whipped out the agency's checkbook and started scribbling, her pen tearing into the paper. Vivian, if this doesn't work, it could bankrupt the agency, Marcus pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. All these years of hard work reduced to ash. If it works, we have $500,000 plus what is in your bank accounts, she hissed back, her face twisted with a mix of greed and lust. If you divorce her, she could fight you for the money, the house, the assets, even the company. Would you prefer to lose the company to that old bitch? Plus, you get me. You know I can do things to you she never dreamed of. I will make your every wish, your every fantasy come true. Marcus didn't need another word. He grabbed the pen, his hand shaking as he signed his name. Hill took the check, checking the routing numbers with a practiced eye before tucking it into his jacket. If this doesn't cash, I'm coming for you. I promise it will, Marcus stammered. How are you going to do it? It has to look like an accident, Hill said, his tone detached. You mentioned that tomorrow she will be going up the canyon to play bridge with an old friend of hers. Those canyons have steep hills. If her car was to lose brakes around a sharp curve, it would be just another car wreck for the California Highway Patrol to clean up. He paused, a grimace flickering across his face. That is not usually my method. I prefer a bullet up close or a rifle from a rooftop. But I can make this work. I hope she burns in hell, Vivian spat, her voice ringing with genuine malice. Hill just looked at Marcus for a long, heavy second, the kind of stare that made a man feel like he was already dead. Keep my number just in case. As they hurried out of the office, eager to get back to their fairy tale life, I walked over to the desk. I looked at Hill, then out at the office where Joe and Polly were standing, their faces grim. We had the check. We had the confession. And now we had exactly 24 hours to turn the table on the most dangerous game I'd ever played. Chapter 6. Hill leaned against the door frame, checking his watch as the streetlights outside cast long, hard shadows across the office floor. He looked at me, waiting for the command. How the hell do you want to play this, Morgan? Hill asked. I paused, got a sly half grin, and said, Do you think you can find us a body? Middle-aged lady, about 5 feet 3 inches, 140 pounds. Johnny replied, his voice steady, as if he were talking about a used car part. I know a guy that might be able to help in that department. He works at the morgue. I'm sure he has some Jane Does laying around that nobody would ask questions about. I have a mother-in-law you could use, Polly said, leaning against the desk with a smirk. And deprive you of such a lovely woman, Polly? We could never, Joe said, shaking his head. I'm just trying to help, Polly said. Out in the outer office, Sarge was still at her desk, her back to the partition, but I could tell she was listening. She kept her focus on the paperwork in front of her, keeping the perimeter quiet and the office locked down while we hashed out the dirty details. The room quieted down, the humor evaporating as the reality of the next 24 hours set in. I stood up, feeling the ache in my joints from a long day of playing games with killers. Johnny, talk to your guy, I said, grabbing my coat. I am going to go talk to the wife. If I can get her on board with faking her death, we meet at the diner for breakfast, then set the plan in motion. I walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind me. The street air was cold, smelling of asphalt and impending trouble. I knew the conversation I was heading into with Doris would be the make or break moment. If she didn't have the stomach for the dark, the whole thing would be over before it started. The drive to the Pentlow home was stressful enough, but I got caught in heavy traffic, which gave me too much time to think. I had to lay out a plan that I wasn't even sure would work, a plan she wouldn't truly understand. I parked the DeSoto a block away and walked the rest of the distance. If Marcus came home, he'd recognize my face from the office, and that would sink us before we even started. I knocked on the door. It took a minute or two before it finally opened. Mr. Morgan, Doris said, looking down her nose at me. What are you doing here? Don't you have something you should be doing? That's off, lady, I said, my voice low. Now it's about trying to keep you alive. May I come in? Heavens, no, Doris replied, her eyes widening. What would the neighbors think if they saw me let you in? Okay, I said. I wasn't in the mood for parlor games. Let's go about this another way. Unless you want to die, move your ass. I'm coming into the fucking house. I don't want to be seen here as much as you don't want me seen here. I pushed past her and into the foyer of the fancy house. Tomorrow morning, you need to fake your death, I said, closing the door behind me. Doris looked as if I'd struck her. Fake my death? What do you mean? Just as I said, you need to disappear for a few days. Book a hotel out of town. Use an alias. Pay in cash for everything. You cannot leave a trail. Pack only the essentials, a few days' worth of clothes. It has to look like you're going to spend a few days with a friend. Still confused, she asked, Is there anything else? Yes, I answered. We also need your car. Why in the world would you need my car? Don't you have your own? She asked. For the plan to work, it has to be your car. I replied. What are you going to do with my car? Run it off a cliff, I said. She stared at me, unable to tell if I was joking or if I was dead serious. What is this brilliant plan you have concocted, detective? We fake your death. Once the story hits the papers and your husband collects on the insurance policy, you come back and confront him. You have enough evidence on both him and Vivian Drax to send them up the river for the rest of their rotten lives. I don't know if I can do this, Mr. Morgan, Doris said, her voice wavering. What if it doesn't work? It has to work, I said. If not, Marcus will hire another to kill you. The next one might not be an old friend of mine. You're friends with a killer? She asked, aghast. Several, actually. In this line of work, you need as many resources as you can get. Okay, I'll do as you ask, she said, steadying herself. I just have one final question. When the police find the car and there is no body, how will this work? There will be a body in the car, I assured her. Provided by your friend, no doubt, she said. Before I could respond, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. It was Marcus. Shit, I hissed. I need to get out of here. He can't see me. Tonight, do not act like anything is out of the ordinary. I know it is going to be hard, knowing what you know, but you must try. Your life depends on it. I will try my best, Doris said. Go out the back door and through the garden. There is a gate that leads to the edge of the property. Try not to stomp all over my prize-winning flowers. I'll buy you new ones, I said. I turned and faded into the night, slipping through the shadows of the garden and out the gate, making my way back down the road to where the DeSoto sat waiting. A million things raced through my mind on the drive back to the office. Every variable, every potential slip-up, and every way this could turn into a bloodbath played out in the dark of the cab. When I pulled up, Joe and Sarge were already packing up for the night. The office felt quieter than usual, the hum of the day replaced by the heavy silence of anticipation. How did she take it? Joe asked, looking up from his briefcase. About as good as we figured she would, but she agreed to it, I said, leaning against the doorframe. After breakfast, giving Marcus enough time to get to the agency, we pick up the car. Doris should be gone, checking into a hotel out of town. Have you heard from Hill? He called about 20 minutes ago, Joe answered. He said the body is ready. Sarge stopped what she was doing, her gaze lingering on me for a moment. I hope you know what you're doing. I do too, Sarge, I said, my voice heavy. I do too. I scooped Hammett up off the chair and hoisted him onto my shoulders, the cat's familiar weight a small comfort in the middle of this mess. See you at the diner. I closed the office door behind me, the lock clicking with a finality that echoed in the empty hallway. When I got to the apartment, Rose was curled up on the sofa, the radio playing low in the background while she read. I stepped inside, placed Hammett on the floor, and walked over to her. I'm finally home, dear, I said. Rose looked up, closing her book with a gentle snap. She studied my face for a second. I can tell by the tone of your voice that it has been one of those days. I let out a weary chuckle. My love, you don't know the half of it. Are you hungry? She asked. I am hungry enough to eat the southbound end of a northbound horse, I said, the grimness of the day trying to shed itself just for a moment. Rose grinned, a soft, grounding look that reminded me exactly why I was putting my neck on the line. For people like Doris. I think we're out of that, but we have a couple steaks in the icebox. It's not horse ass, but we can suffer through. You start the steaks, I will peel some potatoes. We worked in the kitchen in a rhythm we'd perfected over the year of marriage. The sizzling of the meat and the hum of the radio drowned out the sound of the city outside. We sat down to the meal, the red wine a welcome warmth against the chill I couldn't seem to shake. After dinner, we didn't turn on the lights. We tuned the radio until we found a slow, syrupy song, and we danced in the living room. For a few minutes, there were no hitmen, no insurance policies, and no canyons. There was just the weight of her in my arms, the rhythm of the music, and the desperate, quiet hope that tomorrow, when the sun came up, we'd still have a home to come back to. The hot water had done its best to scrub the city grit from my skin, but it couldn't wash away the plan. I climbed into bed, feeling the weight of the mattress settle around me. Beside me, Rose was already gone, lost in that deep, peaceful rhythm of a woman who didn't carry the secrets of the dead in her pocket. I lay there staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. I turned my head to watch her. Even in the dim light, she looked like a different world, a place where things made sense and people didn't go around plotting funerals for their own wives. A smile tugged at my mouth, though it felt heavy. I couldn't help but wonder what I'd ever done to deserve her. Sometimes, late at night, I wasn't even sure I deserved to be in the same room with her, let alone waking up next to her every morning. But she was my anchor. She was the reason the long, hard days didn't break me. Every time I felt like I was drowning in the filth of this job, she was the steady hand that kept me from throwing in the towel. She made the intolerable bearable. A soft thud broke the silence. Hammett leaped onto the bed, his weight shifting the covers as he circled twice before settling down right against my side. I reached out, my fingers finding the spot behind his ears. He leaned into the touch, letting out a small, sandpaper-rough lick against the back of my hand, before his breathing deepened into a contented purr. Eventually, the exhaustion dragged me under. But there was no peace in it. My mind didn't shut down. It just replayed the canyon, the car, the body from the morgue, and the look on Marcus Pentlow's face when he realized he'd been played. I drifted through a landscape of twisted metal and hushed whispers, waiting for the morning light to tell me if we'd saved a life or just dug another grave. Chapter 7. The diner was a study in steam and noise. The morning rush was in full swing, a symphony of clattering porcelain, the aggressive hiss of the espresso machine, and the low, constant rumble of ordinary people starting their day. We sat in the back booth, hidden away from the prying eyes of the main dining room. Hill had the map spread out, weighted down by a half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs. Joe was busy stirring his coffee, his eyes tracking the front door like a sentry, while Paulie poked at his bacon with a fork. A familiar perfume cut through the smell of burnt coffee and grease. Rose stopped by our booth, her coffee pot in hand, a warm, professional smile on her face that she reserved for the customers. "Need a refill on the black gold?" she asked, her eyes landing on me. "Always, Rose," I said. I leaned back, gesturing to the man sitting across from me. "Hey, before you head back, I want you to meet someone. Rose, this is Johnny Hill. Johnny, this is my wife, Rose." Hill stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. He offered a quick, respectful nod, the kind he used to give the CO back in the day. "A pleasure, Mrs. Morgan. Jack's talked about you enough that I feel like I already know you." Rose's smile deepened, turning genuine. "It's a pleasure, Johnny. Any friend of Jack's is welcome here. Although I hope you're not the one responsible for him coming home looking like he's been wrestling with a bear." "If I had anything to do with that, ma'am, he'd have come home in much worse shape," Hill joked, his voice losing its usual gravel for a second. "Get back to work, Rose," I said with a grin, "or the regulars will start revolting." "The regulars are fine, Jack. It's the company you keep I'm worried about," she teased, giving my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze before moving on to the next booth. As soon as she was out of earshot, the air at the table shifted. Hill sat back down, the smile vanishing as he returned to the map. "The morgue truck is going to be at the turnout by 5 this evening," Hill said, his voice low. "My guy has the Jane Doe ready. She's small, fits the profile. He's swapping the paperwork, scrubbing the intake records, and getting her into the back of a black coupe we've got tagged for the job." "And the Canyon Road?" I asked. "Deserted," Joe added, leaning in. "Maintenance crew isn't due out there until Wednesday. We've got a window, but it's thin. The drop is steep enough that a car going off the edge is going to look exactly like what it is. A bad curve. The fire will do the rest." "What about the insurance trail?" I asked. "Marcus is going to want to move fast on that policy." "He's already got his lawyer sniffing around the precinct," Hill said, a dry, humorless smirk touching his lips. "He's trying to play the distraught husband. It's convincing enough for the beat cops, but the insurance adjusters are going to want a death certificate. That's why the body swap has to be clean. If they look too close, they'll see the scars don't match Doris's medical records." Paulie finally sighed, dropping his fork. "Look, if we're really going through with this, we need to make sure the car's wiped. I don't want any of our prints on the steering wheel or the handles. That car goes off that ledge. It needs to be a clean slate." "Already handled," Joe said. "I've got the gloves and the acid. Once we plant the body, the interior gets a wipe down. By the time it hits the bottom, there won't be a fingerprint on that chassis left to find." The weight of it sat on the table. It wasn't just about the mechanics of a car crash. It was about orchestrating a phantom. "And Doris?" Polly asked, looking at me. "Is she going to hold up? She's a civilian, Morgan. She cracks under pressure. She walks right into Marcus's arms." "She knows the alternative," I said firmly. I put it to her straight. She's terrified, and fear is a hell of a motivator. She's checking into the hotel under an alias. She won't come out until I call. Still, Paulie muttered, shaking his head, I wouldn't trust a dame with that much to lose to keep her trap shut for a week. "She doesn't have a choice," I countered. "Her life is the wager. We're just the ones playing the hand." Joe glanced toward the door. "We're running out of time. We need to move the car to the canyon turnout before the sun hits its peak." I stood up, the booth bench groaning. I tossed a handful of change onto the table. "Get to the turnout," I said. "Hill, confirm with your guy one last time. Joe, you and Paulie prep the coupe. I'm heading to the estate to make sure the wife is out of the house. If I see even a shadow of Marcus, I'll signal. Don't engage unless you have to." "Check," Hill said, folding the map. "And Morgan," Joe called out as I turned away. "Don't worry about the flowers. We'll make sure the landing zone is clear of the garden. See you on the other side," I said. I walked out into the bright, unforgiving morning light, the diner's warmth dying behind me as I stepped into the day that would decide whether Doris Pentlow lived to see another one. Doris was already gone. She'd checked into a high-end resort in Palm Springs under the name Gertrude Bryant. She hated the name, which was exactly why Sarge had picked it. It was a small, petty victory, but it made her feel a little more human and a little less like a ghost in the making. She was safe and tucked away in a beautiful spot to be dead for a few days. Truth be told, when this was all over, I thought I might like to go die in a place like that myself for a while. But there was no time for daydreams. We had a job to finish. We were prepping the scene when a sedan pulled over, an elderly man behind the wheel slowing to a crawl. We all nearly collectively shit our trousers. "You boys having car trouble?" the old man asked, peering through his spectacles. We were positioned strategically, forming a human wall between his vantage point and the Pentlow car, masking the plates and the interior. Paulie didn't miss a beat, his voice smooth as silk. "Yes, but I believe we have it fixed. A wire came loose. Okay, I was driving by and saw you all out here," the man said, gesturing to the steep drop-off. "This is a dangerous spot to have a breakdown." "Thanks for the concern, Pops," Joe said, leaning against our transport with a forced, casual ease. "Okay, you boys be careful out here," the man said, finally putting his car in gear and driving away. The air didn't return to my lungs until his taillights disappeared around the bend. That was too fucking close, I hissed. Let's get this over with. We moved with a frantic, focused efficiency. We hauled the body into the driver's seat, arranged the limbs, and began the wipe down. Every handle, every dial, every inch of the dash was scrubbed until there wasn't a trace of us left behind. We weren't just clearing prints, we were erasing our existence from the scene. We put our shoulders to the frame and pushed. The car groaned, tilted, and then gravity took hold. It plummeted down the canyon, crashing into the brush below. Silence followed. The kind of heavy, ringing silence that makes your skin crawl. We stood at the edge, peering down, hearts hammering against our ribs. Then, a stray spark found the leaking gasoline. Whoosh! A giant fireball erupted, the heat hitting us like a physical blow, nearly knocking us back. The roar was deafening, a jagged, beautiful noise that signaled the end of Doris Pentlow. "Let's get the hell out of here," Hill said, his face illuminated by the dancing orange light. "Everyone, meet at the office to wait this out," I commanded. They scrambled toward their vehicles, but I lingered for a second. The scene looked too clean, too clinical. It looked like she had just lost control and drifted off the edge. It lacked the jagged, messy reality of a struggle, but that was the point. It had to be boring enough that the insurance investigators wouldn't dig. I hopped into the DeSoto and reversed hard, spinning the tires to lay down a set of skid marks that led right to the precipice. I stopped just at the edge, the front tires teetering on the loose shale. A few more inches and I would have been at the bottom myself, a twist that would have been a hell of a lot harder to explain to the coroner. I backed away, finally pulling a Camel from its pack with my teeth. I struck a match and inhaled, the bite of the smoke cutting through the scent of gasoline and scorched earth. I put the car in gear and turned toward the city lights. I needed a drink, a quiet room, and enough distance from this canyon to forget the sound of that car hitting the rocks. When I got back to the office, everyone else was already there. The room was heavy, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the lingering anxiety of the last few hours. Nobody was moving. They were just waiting for the fallout. "I think we need a drink," I said, setting my coat aside. Joe didn't even look up from the desk. "What the hell is there to celebrate, Jack?" "We are not celebrating," I said, pulling the bottle of rye from my bottom drawer. "We are getting our nerves back. We all look like kids that just pulled a prank, waiting to be found out, and worried they might tell our fathers." Polly, who had been pacing near the window, stopped and let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "If this goes south, a leather belt is the least of our worries." I looked at him, deadpan. "Listen, what you and Veronica do in the bedroom is none of our business." The room snapped. Polly's mouth hung open for a second before he let out a bark of genuine laughter, and even Joe finally cracked a weary smile. Sarge nearly spit her coffee. The tension in the room didn't vanish. You can't just wish away the fact that we just staged a murder, but it thinned out enough to breathe. I poured a generous measure of rye into 5 thick glasses. The amber liquid caught the afternoon light, looking like liquid courage. I passed them out, the clinking of the glasses the only sound in the office for a long moment. I raised my glass. "To the ones that didn't come home," I said, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum. "And if this does not work, I hope they saved room in hell for us all." We downed the rye in one go. It burned all the way down, settling in our guts like lead. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the phone to ring and see if the world believed the story we'd just sold them. Chapter 8, the drive back to the apartment felt like moving through a dream. Every set of headlights that swept across my windshield felt like a spotlight. Every siren in the distance sounded like an accusation. My nerves were frayed, buzzing like a live wire. When I stepped through the door, the apartment was a sanctuary. The radio was playing low and the smell of dinner hit me, a normal, domestic reality that felt entirely alien. Rose was waiting, her eyes searching mine as I came in. She didn't ask questions. She just came over, took my coat, and pressed a hand against my chest, feeling the frantic, uneven thrum of my heart. That night, sleep was a battlefield. I tossed, turning the images of the canyon over and over, while Rose's steady, rhythmic breathing beside me was the only thing keeping me from drifting off into a nightmare. The next morning, when Rose got up for work, the city didn't know yet. The papers hadn't hit the stands. I got up with Rose. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of black coffee as the sun climbed over the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. "You're struggling with this," Rose said softly. She stood by the stove, her posture stiff. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she knew that when I walked out that door today, I was walking into something that might not let me come back. "Very much. The greed and depravity of this world is hard to handle at times," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "Just come back to me tonight, Jack," she whispered, not looking at me. "I'll be home," I promised. But as my lovely wife headed for the door, I didn't know if that was a lie. The office was already humming by the time I arrived. The morning papers were spread across the desk like a crime scene. Local socialite missing in apparent desert mishap. The headline was bold, black, and completely wrong. "They found the car," Hill said the moment I walked in. He was leaning over the desk, pointing to the photo of the charred wreckage resting at the bottom of the canyon. "The sheriff's office just put out the bulletin. They're calling it a tragic disappearance. They haven't found the body yet. The fire was too hot, and the slope is a nightmare for the search crews. They're assuming she's dead." "Which is exactly what we want," I said, taking my seat. "If they can't find her, they can't prove it isn't her." "Marcus is already working the phones," Joe added, tossing a cigarette pack onto the desk. "He's calling every major outlet in the city. He wants to make sure everyone knows exactly how heartbroken he is." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The play was in motion. "Turn the radio on," I ordered. "If he's going to make a statement, I want to hear the sound of his voice when he realizes the show has officially begun." We waited. The tension in the room was a physical weight, thick with the smell of stale coffee and the lingering anxiety of the last few hours. Nobody was moving. We were just waiting for the fallout. Then the static cleared. The beautiful song that was playing suddenly stopped. The radio host's somber introduction filled the room. "Friends, associates, neighbors," Marcus began, his voice dripping with practiced synthetic sorrow. "It is with a heart so shattered that I find it difficult to speak, that I must share the news of a tragedy that has left my world in darkness." I listened to the cadence of his voice. It was perfect. A little too perfect. He gave that practiced, shivering breath, the exact kind of sound an actor would make to sell a scene. "My beloved Doris, my beautiful, vibrant Doris, was taken from us last night. A sudden, senseless accident on the canyon road. A turn she knew by heart. A road she traveled with such grace, turned into the final stage of her journey." Polly let out a wet, disgusted sound, like he'd stepped in something rotten. He moved to the window, staring out at the street, his back turned to the radio. "There are no words for the silence in our home this morning," Marcus continued, his voice dipping into a practiced low register. "No words for the emptiness where there should be laughter. Doris was the light of my life, my partner, my anchor. To say I am devastated would be a pale imitation of the truth. I am a man adrift." Then came the rustle of a dress, the soft, rhythmic clicking of heels on a polished floor. "Vivian. This is Vivian Drax, Mr. Pentlow's assistant, speaking on behalf of the agency." We were all deeply shaken by the loss of Mrs. Pentlow. She was a woman of immense warmth, and we hold the entire Pentlow family in our thoughts. For the time being, the agency will be operating on limited hours out of respect for this terrible loss. We thank you for your understanding. Her voice was like ice water, smooth, composed, and absolutely devoid of a single drop of remorse. She sounded like she was reading a quarterly earnings report, except for that faint, underlying lilt of victory she couldn't quite keep out of her tone. The radio host cut back in, his voice grave. "That was a statement from Marcus Pentlow regarding the tragic passing of his wife, Doris, whose vehicle was discovered in the Blackwood Canyon late last night." I reached out and clicked the radio off. The sudden silence that filled the office was worse than the broadcast. Nobody spoke for a long minute. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Joe finally reached for the rye bottle, poured himself another finger, and downed it in one painful gulp. "That was a hell of a performance," Joe said, his voice quiet. I almost believed him. If I didn't know better, I'd say he's been rehearsing that since the day they got hitched. "He's not a grieving husband. He's a pitchman," I said, leaning back against my desk. "He's selling a product. Today, the product is grief." He could try to fool the city, but we knew the truth. "And she's holding the script," Paulie added, turning back from the window. He looked at me, his eyes hard. "How long do we let them dance? How long before we pull the rug out?" "Not yet," I said. "We let the papers run the story. We let the insurance adjusters do their dance. We wait until he's feeling so comfortable in his new life that he forgets to look behind him. That's when we move." "I hope the insurance company is fast," Sarge said, finally breaking her silence. She was sitting in the corner, her fingers tapping a rhythm on her knee. I don't think I can listen to much more of this without going over there and ending the show myself. I looked at them, my team, my friends, the men and women who had just helped me commit a very messy, very necessary sin. "We wait," I repeated. "The bigger the show, the louder the crash." The waiting was the hardest part. It was a slow, suffocating crawl of days where every knock at the office door sent a jolt of adrenaline through our veins, and every siren outside sounded like a cruiser pulling up to haul us off in cuffs. We were waiting for the crack in the foundation, the overlooked fingerprint, the witness who saw too much, or Doris getting bored and deciding she was ready for her resurrection before the timing was right. Sarge kept the tether short, calling the hotel in Palm Springs twice a day to check on Gertrude. It was almost surreal to hear that she was thriving. She'd even marched herself down to a salon and dyed her hair a deep ink black. It was a smart move, a total transformation, but it sounded like she was treating this whole thing like a holiday. Meanwhile, the rest of us were fraying at the edges. Hill had been pulled away by Pandolini for another job, leaving the office feeling emptier and the silence heavier. Every time the office phone rang, the air in the room would snap tight. Then the bell finally chimed. Sarge picked up, her voice as clipped and professional as ever. "Morgan and Russo Detective Agency," she said, her eyes tracking the room. "Just a minute." She cupped the receiver and looked at the heavy-set man leaning against the filing cabinet. "Paulie, it's for you." Paulie frowned, pushing off the cabinet and lumbering over to her desk. He took the phone, his expression guarded. "Yeah," he grunted. He listened, his brow furrowing, then smoothing out. A long beat of silence stretched between us, the ticking of the wall clock feeling like a countdown. Finally, he hung up the receiver and turned toward us. The grin that spread across his face wasn't the usual smirk. It was a jagged, relieved look that seemed to drain a week's worth of tension from his shoulders. "Get Johnny on the horn," Paulie said, his voice brimming with a dark kind of triumph. "That was Veronica's friend from the insurance agency. They just cut the check." I felt the knots in my stomach loosen, just enough for me to finally catch a full breath. The house of cards hadn't just held. It had been signed, sealed, and delivered by the very people we were trying to play. "Well," I said, finally pushing myself up from the desk. "The check is in the mail. Now let's see how long it takes Marcus to start spending money he hasn't actually earned yet." I looked at the phone, then at my team. The game had shifted. The Phantom was established, the payout was confirmed, and now the trap was officially baited. "Sarge, please call Pandolini. Tell him Hill is needed for another mission." Chapter 9. The check had cleared, but the payout wasn't a moment of relief. It was the starting gun. We didn't have time to savor the win. The air in our office felt thin, the scent of the rye now cloying and sour. We all knew that Marcus wasn't the type to wait for the grass to grow under his feet. He was an advertising man. He understood the value of a fast exit better than anyone. "He's not going to wait for the funeral, Jack," Joe said, his eyes fixed on the empty glass in his hand. He's got the money. He's got the grief narrative sold to the public. He's going to move while the sun is still behind him. I didn't argue. I grabbed my coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor. Get the others. We're going to Pentlow and Gates. We rolled up to the agency 20 minutes later. The building was an imposing slab of chrome and glass, the kind of place where men in suits traded in other people's dreams. We didn't bother with the receptionist. We moved through the main floor with a purposeful, unyielding gravity cutting through the bullpen like a shark through a school of minnows. The hallways of Pentlow and Gates were quiet. Too quiet. The frantic, caffeine-fueled energy that usually hummed through the office was absent, replaced by a strange, hollow stillness. We reached the corner suite with the frosted glass door, the one marked Marcus Pentlow, senior partner. I didn't knock. I shoved the door open. The office was stripped bare. The heavy mahogany desk was a hollow shell. The walls, usually adorned with framed campaigns and local awards, were nothing but rectangular patches of dust-free paint. Jerry Gates, Marcus's partner, was the only one in the room. He was sitting at the desk, sorting through a stack of invoices with the confused, irritable expression of a man who'd just been left holding the bag. He looked up, his brow furrowing as he saw 4 strangers filing into his private office, looking like a storm front that had just blown in off the street. "Can I help you?" Gates asked, his voice sharp with professional annoyance. "This is a private office. I don't know who you are, but you're trespassing." I ignored the indignation. I walked over to the bare desk that had been Marcus's. "Where is he, Gates?" Gates blinked, his hand pausing on a stack of letterhead. "Who, Pentlow? He hasn't been in since the news broke. And for the record, he hasn't been in touch with me either. Just sent a courier over this morning with a signed contract of sale." "He sold his half to you?" I asked, keeping my tone flat. "Sold it, liquidated it, and vanished," Gates said, his annoyance shifting toward a nervous curiosity. "He didn't give me a forwarding address. Just told me he needed to get away after the accident." "Why? Who are you people?" I looked at the empty office. It was a perfect reflection of Marcus. All image, no substance. He had turned his life into a transient, temporary thing, something he could pack into a suitcase and discard whenever the reality of his own sins started to catch up. "He didn't mention Europe or the islands?" Joe asked, stepping forward. Gates stood up, his face hardening. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I don't appreciate the interrogation. Marcus is a grieving man who just lost his wife in a horrific accident. If you've got business with him, I suggest you take it to the funeral home, not my office." "He's not a grieving man, Gates," I said, turning back to the team. "He's been fucking his secretary right under your nose and is now running off with her." We left Gates to his empty office and headed for the estate. The drive was a silent one, the kind that forces a man to weigh what he's about to do against everything he's already lost. The Pentlow mansion sat on the hill like a fortress of glass and stone, isolated from the city that had unwittingly bankrolled its owner's escape. We didn't take the driveway. We left the car in the brush a quarter-mile out and moved through the woods, keeping low behind the manicured hedges. We reached the rear terrace just as the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn. Inside the study, the lights were bright. Marcus was there, his back to the glass, throwing clothes into a leather Samsonite with the panicked intensity of a man being hunted by his own shadow. Vivian was nearby, her composure replaced by a sharp, jittery focus. She was clutching a stack of envelopes, passports, no doubt. "Look at him," Paulie hissed, his eyes locked on the room. "The bastard already has his bags packed." I took a deep breath, the cold evening air biting at my lungs. I reached for the handle of the patio door. "Stay close," I whispered to the team. "If he thinks he's walking out of here, he's in for a hell of a surprise." I pushed the door open. The heavy frame groaned, swinging inward and shattering the silence of the house. Marcus spun around, the shirt in his hands dropping to the floor. His face went from flushed with excitement to the color of bone in a heartbeat. You? He breathed, his voice cracking. What? What are you doing here? I stepped into the light of the study, the shadow of my hat cutting across his face. You forgot to settle the account, Marcus, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden, terrified silence of the room. And in this business, we don't believe in running out on the bill. What made you think we would pay lowlifes like you? Vivian spat, her composure cracking to reveal a jagged, frantic edge. It's our money. We're leaving this fucking town and we're starting fresh. Hill stepped into the pool of light, his presence heavy and suffocating. Because you know exactly what happens if you don't. I told you I had eyes all over the city, and I meant it. I just had the hope you wouldn't be stupid enough to try to fuck me over. Especially you, Pentlow. The little bitch? I knew better than to trust her from the start, and you shouldn't have either. She'll put a knife in your back the second you stop being useful, and she won't even bother to hire someone to do it. You can see it in her eyes. She's just waiting for the right angle. How dare you speak of her like that? Pentlow shouted, puffing out his chest, his face flushing a dangerous mottled red. Deflate yourself, I said, my hand resting casually near my piece, or I'll do it for you with a bullet. I'm going to make this very simple. Pay the money you owe, or both of you die right here, right now. Don't do it, baby, Vivian hissed, her eyes darting between me and the door. Come on, Marcus, Polly added, a bored, lethal tone to his voice. Don't let this dame get you killed. She isn't worth the floorboards. Pentlow wavered, his gaze flickering from the luggage to the door, then back to us. He saw the cold, immovable reality in our faces. Fine, I'll pay you, just to get us out of here. We have a boat to catch. In cash, Hill added, his voice like gravel grinding on stone. Marcus lunged for the leather bag, his fingers trembling as he counted out the bills. He slapped the stack of notes into Hill's waiting palm. $250,000, crisp and fresh from the bank. Hill thumbed through the bills, then looked at Pentlow with a hollow, mocking smile. You didn't tell your partner at the agency that the other half of this payout came out of the company account, did you? Of course you didn't, you greedy fuck. You'd have your wife killed and bankrupt the company you spent years building just for this little piece of ass. He gestured toward Vivian with his chin. It must be pretty good. When she finally bumps you off, I might just have to try it for myself. Pentlow's eyes bulged, his hands balling into white-knuckled fists. The rage hit him like a physical blow, exactly what Hill had been aiming for. Get out of here, Marcus roared, his voice cracking. All of you. Before you what, Marcus? Joe interrupted, taking a slow, predatory step forward. Call the law. We have more than enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your natural lives. If you're going to go, now's the time. Because if we ever catch you in this city again, the only place you're going is in a box. We didn't wait for a rebuttal. We turned our backs on them, walking out into the cooling night air, leaving them in the silent, empty house. Two people who had everything they ever wanted, and were about to discover that getting it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. We hadn't made it 3 steps off the terrace when a taxi pulled up, gravel crunching under its tires. It wasn't the hired car Marcus was expecting. A woman stepped out, small, draped in a trench coat, wearing dark sunglasses that caught the porch light. She pulled them off, revealing her newly dyed ink-black hair, Doris. She didn't look at us. She didn't acknowledge our existence. She walked past us, like we were nothing more than lawn ornaments, her movements stiff, sharp, and radiating a cold, mechanical violence. We turned on our heels, instincts screaming at us to intervene, but we were paralyzed by the sheer momentum of her arrival. She crossed the threshold into the study. Marcus and Vivian were still standing there, the shock of our departure barely having faded, when the air turned absolute zero. Going somewhere, Marcus? Doris asked. Her voice wasn't a scream, it was a blade. Marcus gasped, his face draining of what little color it had left. What? How? You're supposed to be dead. I am dead, Marcus, Doris hissed, closing the distance between them. I am your sins coming back to haunt you. Vivian's lips parted, her face going a pasty, translucent white. She tried to stutter a defense, but it died in her throat. Doris didn't wait for the pleading. She reached into her handbag with a fluid practice motion and produced a pistol. She leveled it between Vivian's eyes, her finger tightening on the trigger. Crack! The sound was sharp, sudden, and final. Vivian dropped to the floor, dead before her body hit the hardwood. Marcus scrambled backward, collapsing onto his knees, his hands trembling in the air. Please don't do this, Doris. Think of the life we lived together. Think of the good times. Doris, I shouted, taking a step toward the study, my voice cutting through the ringing silence. Doris, stop! She didn't hear me. She didn't hear anything. She was a woman possessed by the ghost of her own life. Yes, Marcus, we had a good life, she said, her voice dripping with venom, until you threw it away for this slut bleeding out on my freshly waxed floor. Doris, no, Marcus began, but the plea was cut short. Crack. He didn't collapse instantly. He hovered there for a heartbeat, his eyes wide with a frantic animal terror, blood spilling from his nose and mouth. Then he crumpled onto his side, a broken pile of expensive clothes and shattered schemes. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating stillness. The only sound was the settling of the house and the drip of blood onto the floor. Put it down, Doris, I pleaded, my hands held out, trying to bridge the distance. It's over. You won. There's nothing left to pay for. She turned toward me, but her eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking at something far off, somewhere past the horizon of her own grief. You call this winning? She asked, her voice hollow. She didn't lower the barrel. We all saw the next move before her muscles even twitched, a final, grim geometry. Before I could cross the room, before the warning died in my throat, she pressed the cold steel under her chin and squeezed the trigger a third time. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. She fell beside him, the final piece of the tragedy clicking perfectly, bloodily into place. We stood in the doorway, the smoke from the pistol swirling in the warm study air, watching as the phantom finally found the rest she had been looking for. Chapter 10. The office was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The weight of the canyon, the radio broadcast, and the bloody mess at the estate had finally settled. We were all frayed, dusted with the soot of a long, dark week. But for the first time in days, the air didn't feel like it was vibrating with imminent disaster. Hill stood by the window, watching the city lights blink on one by one. He had been quiet since we got back, his face unreadable in the dim light of the office. Finally, he turned, breaking the silence with a soft, thoughtful hum. Jack, I've been thinking, he said, his gravelly voice sounding steady. It's been nice to be back with you crazy bastards again. I can't promise I won't still take a job here and there on the side, but when I do, it would be nice to have an efficient team behind me. So, what do you say? Is there room at the detective agency for an old army buddy? I looked at Joe. We had been through more hell in the last 10 days than most men see in a lifetime. Joe caught my eye, a slow, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. What do you think? I asked. Joe leaned back, folding his arms. There's always room for you, Hill. There's a room in the back. It's got a cot we can clean out. Paulie likes to sleep on the couch anyway, so it's going to waste. Paulie didn't even look up from his magazine, just grinned. It's comfortable. Don't let Joe talk you out of it. Hill let out a short, surprised laugh. He looked at me, his expression softening. Jack, that money you offered, forget about it. Put it towards a nice desk for me. Something that doesn't wobble. I walked over and clapped a hand on his shoulder. You've got a deal, pal. Sarge, who had been busy filing away the final paperwork on the Pentlow case, let out a long, weary breath. A genuine smile touched her lips as she shook her head. Oh, great. Just what we needed. Another one of you to wrangle. That's right, Sarge, I said, a rare, genuine sense of relief washing over me. Get used to it. Hill looked over at Paulie, his eyes bright with a spark of the old camaraderie. How about we all go have that drink now? I think I've earned a stiff one, and I'm pretty sure the rest of you have too. I grabbed my coat off the hook, feeling the familiar weight of the world, but for once, it didn't feel like it was crushing me. "I know just the place," I said, ushering them toward the door. We stepped out of the office and into the cool, forgiving night air. The city was still out there, greedy, violent, and indifferent. But we were heading out to the dark, quiet corner of a bar where we could just be men again. We were survivors, and for tonight, that was enough. The night was a heavy, humid blur of neon, cigarette smoke, and the sharp, clean burn of rye whiskey. We had earned this night. After the long, suffocating days of the Pentlow business, the Blue Lantern felt like a sanctuary. It was a basement dive that smelled of stale beer and history, a place where the shadows were deep enough to hide a man's sins, at least for a few hours. We pooled our money for the first round, and the stories began to flow. The tension of the last few days dissolved into loud, cathartic laughter and exaggerated tales of the hunt. For a moment, the four of us weren't just detectives. We were just survivors, basking in the glow of a job finished. The band, a three-piece outfit that looked like they'd seen better decades, kicked into a slow, melancholic blues number. The room dimmed, the rhythm shifting from boisterous to intimate. Sarge caught Joe's eye, a silent challenge that he accepted without hesitation, taking her hand and leading her to the small, cramped dance floor. Rose nudged me, her eyes twinkling with a soft, persistent warmth. "To the floor, Morgan." I didn't argue. I took her into my arms, the world narrowing down to the space between us. As we swayed, I caught a glimpse of Joe and Sarge in the periphery. They weren't just dancing. They were locked in a quiet, private world. Joe's hand rested low on her back, his posture uncharacteristically protective, and Sarge leaned into his shoulder with a trust that was startling to see. They looked like an anchor in a storm, solid, tethered, and perfectly matched. When the music finally wound down, I caught Joe by the bar, grabbing us 2 fresh refills. I didn't beat around the bush. We weren't the kind of men who did. "Is there something between you and Sarge?" Joe's tough guy exterior cracked, yielding to a sheepish, honest grin. "Yeah," he admitted, swirling his glass. "We're giving it a shot. We've already set the ground rules. If it gets in the way of the work, we kill it. But for now, it's good, Jack." I looked at him, feeling a genuine warmth that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "Brother, I love you both. You're adults. You don't need my permission, but you've got my blessing. Just don't let it cloud your aim." Joe's grin deepened, and for a second his eyes looked a little glassy. He glanced over at Sarge, who was watching us from the edge of the floor, her expression softening into a radiant, unguarded smile. "I told you he'd be okay with it," he murmured. But the night had one more act, a final, jagged disruption of our peace. Johnny was drifting back from the floor when a heavy-set lug stepped into his path. The guy had a face like a slab of granite, eyes clouded with cheap booze, and a temper that was already overflowing. He shoved Johnny square in the chest. "Hey, pal, that's my girl you were dancing with. You got a death wish?" Hill didn't even break his stride. "Nice girl," he muttered, dismissing the man as if he were a fly. He turned his back to walk toward our booth, a lethal calm in his shoulders. The man didn't take the dismissal. He shoved Johnny again, harder this time, stumbling him into a cocktail table. It was the classic mistake. Johnny didn't just fight. He was a machine. He pivoted on a dime, a shark-like grin flashing across his face, and planted a right cross into the guy's jaw with a sickening crack. The man went down like a heavy curtain hitting the floor, out cold before he even hit the wood. That was the signal. 4 of his friends stood up from a nearby table, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor, their intentions written in their tightening knuckles and slurred threats. I looked at Joe and Paulie. They were already moving, their faces lit with that same familiar, dangerous joy. There was no hesitation, no debate. Rose and Sarge didn't lift a finger to stop us. They just stepped back into the shadows, watching with the calm, knowing eyes of women who understood exactly who we were and what we were built for. The brawl was beautiful in its own chaotic way. The air filled with the grunt of impact, the sound of splintering chairs, and the crash of shattered glass. For a few glorious minutes, the office, the case, and the dead men in the study vanished. There was only the weight of a fist, the presence of your team at your back, and the simple animal relief of letting the rage out. When the dust settled, the lounge was quiet again, save for the heavy breathing of the band and the low moans of the men on the floor. I stood over a pile of broken furniture, tasting the metallic tang of a busted lip. Paulie was dabbing at his eye, already sporting the beginnings of a nasty shiner, and both Joe and Johnny were spitting blood onto the scarred floorboards, laughing at something only they could hear. We stood there for a heartbeat, chests heaving, adrenaline fading into a steady, rhythmic pulse. We looked at each other, battered, bloodied, and grinning like idiots. We didn't wait for the cops. We didn't wait for the tab. We walked out into the cool, forgiving night air together, arm in arm, the shadows swallowing us whole. Just like old times.